is the difference between a cult and a religion? This is part of my series on, is your IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, culty? And to have a critical viewpoint of this denomination and to understand what you need to understand to make a wise decision about where you go to church. I have several questions that I'm going to answer in this. The first was, is your IFB church culty? And I did that in the first video. This is the difference between a cult and a religion. Then man worship. Is it in your IFB church? The church leader, does your church leader need church disciplined? When should the police be informed? And really, should the police be informed about your church leader? When should you leave your church and how? Does the IFB systematically teach abuse? Does biblical patriarchy promote abuse? And does the IFB systematically hide sexual abuse? These are all very, very important questions, because as we get farther and farther into a culture, the United States, we live in the United States, and but every culture has a cycle, and it gets worse and worse as it goes round and round and reaches its end. And we don't want to get caught up in things that the Bible doesn't want you to. Or even if there's truth, does anybody, is it about you or is it about the Bible? So just have a critical thinking mindset. Don't be simple and believe every word. Two things I want you to recognize when distinguishing a cult from a religion is that there's two different ways of looking at cult. One is a theological, biblical way of looking at a cult, where you would say, does the teaching of this denomination or church match up with Scripture? The other is, does this belief system meet the qualifications for what our society deems as a cult? One has an absolute authority based upon a divine book. In this case, I'm mentioning the Bible. And the other is very subjective, literally defined by what harmful means in whoever's interpreting it in that culture. So I'm going to give you the differences based upon popular culture in universities, because that's who seems to be writing these answers on the top 2 pages of Google. And it's the cultural atheistic view of a cult. The first is, almost everybody says that the first characteristic point of a cult is that it's led by a charismatic leader. But in a cult, I'm going to compare what the difference between the cult and the religious between the charismatic leader. With a cult, it's a group of people who follow a charismatic person to its detriment, like mass suicide or inbreeding, because they are in this little cloister and nobody really comes in. It's only people who are kind of born in that. Even then, some of those are accepted culturally as religions, but it tends to be to its detriment because they haven't propagated anybody in there, because people on the outside are like, whoa, nope, nobody, nope, nope. And it has a whole bunch of sexual perversion in that community because of inbreeding and the need to have outside bloodlines. A religion, on the other side of it, is likely to have a morality and a vision that has long-term benefits to its followers and the surrounding society. So the leader is leading them in something, but the outside community can say, you know what, that's actually not a bad thing. If you look at the practical fruits of it, actually a hard work ethic is beneficial. And a family environment with a father in the home is societally beneficial. So what they're promoting is a good thing, and it doesn't kind of get shunned from the outside, and so it lasts. It has sustainability, and sustainability is probably the key word that you'll see is the difference between a cult and a religion when cultural definitions are defining it. Now, number two, a cult is sometimes determined as such because the government views it as a threat to their rule. And this happened in China. I don't know how to pronounce this religion. It's Falun, Falun Gong, was abruptly labeled a cult when it became so popular that its followers exceeded the numbers of the Chinese Communist Party. And so they viewed it as a threat, and they were like, nope, that is outlawed. It is a cult. No longer is it a teaching that's going to be allowed in this country. So there's that. Whereas a religion is often accepted in the governments if it's not deemed as a threat. And this one's kind of tricky because Baptists, because they hold the Bible as their ultimate authority and therefore they value independent individual freedom of conscience, and therefore they will have a higher authority than the government or the church religion or the state religion, you will see that they get labeled as cults almost everywhere they go. So that's kind of hard and a little bit unjust that because you promote freedom of thought that you are labeled as a cult. Because I feel like cults promote the lack of freedom of conscience and the lack of freedom of thought. So you'll see that they're called nonconformists, separatists, and then they're ostracized and kicked out of their countries or killed. So I feel like that's an unfair definition. But a religion is often accepted in governments if it's not deemed a threat and is not breaking any laws. That is a good point if your society is based upon moral laws. But if your law says you're allowed to meet, to pray or sing, like in the case of William Penn went to prison several times for trying to meet with the Quakers to pray on a street corner because they weren't allowed to congregate in their houses, which is why when William Penn moved here and had Pennsylvania, he had freedom of religion for everybody. And it caused a big problem because the Quakers said, no, we want to run the government in Pennsylvania. And we believe that only Quakers should be in roles of the government when in Pennsylvania. And he said, no, that's the problem with all of them, is that it's my way or the highway. I want freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. So can the government really tell you that what is right and what is wrong? But religions often last long enough in their society to gain, in America, tax-exempt status. So it's not so much a threat that the government will take away its tax-exempt status. Number 3, a cult leader exercises such great control over the everyday lives and will use bullying, confessions, shaming to obtain that retain of control. And I am going to talk a little bit about this in the man worship side of things in the IFB church, but you will see this with the Pope, that level of control. You just read your history and understand that when one man is the authority, although he's not held accountable to the same measure, like how many children the popes have had, with many, many, many women, and the perversion in the church, in the Catholic Church, and the Mormon presidents. There's no real accountability for these men who can. The Mormon Church really is a great example of how they meddle in your lives. If you read Unveiling Grace by Lynn Wilder, and she talks about how from up here, then it goes to the bishops, and then they can go and say, we want you to work this job. We feel like you need to have this many hours at this place, and then your husband needs to go here, and your children need to go here. And they really control. It's a really well-oiled machine, but they control all those little details of the faithful Mormons. And then when it comes to the communes, it gets worse and very, very perverted. But arrogant pastors, not just Baptist pastors, people in leadership, this just seems to be what it is. And that one of the marked things is that oral tradition, the standards that they set up that aren't particularly biblical, but can be interpreted in a certain way, and then they hold those and emphasize that oral tradition above God's written word. That seems to be significant. And so they exert that control into personal decisions like who to marry, where to work, what to wear, and often specifics about their sex life. Most often, the leadership is not subject to the same scrutiny or enjoys this. You'll see this over and over. They enjoy the special sexual privileges such as commanding sex from followers. You see that with Joseph Smith, Muhammad, the Pope. Anyway, a religion, on the other hand, hopefully has accountability. An accountability above the leader, above the man, that can hold the man accountable. And I think that's really important about Scripture, because Scripture has a list of qualifications for their leaders, for their pastors, for the deacons, for the deacon's family. And then it has a way to, step by step, hold them accountable and remove them from office, and to announce publicly that others may fear, because God cares about who represents his image. And number 4, a cult discloses their teachings to their members only. And this one again is kind of iffy, because Mormons do share their books publicly. Anybody could read them. But they also have those traditions that are only told to the faithful Mormons who are temple worthy. And then once they're in the temple, then they go through these ceremonies that are secret. There are people who have exposed what those ceremonies are, and then they've had to change because some of them are a little bit scandalous. And again, so the presidents or whoever is in charge at that time, they can change the doctrine and they can change it. So just because they have these books doesn't mean that's how they operate in a practical sense of it. I think that Scientology is the same way. They'll share what their books are, but behind closed doors, it's a little bit different than what they say. And I think that the Bible, I believe the King James is God's preserved word, and there are lots and lots of Bibles, so that then whoever knows Greek best really becomes the authority, or the one who's the most educated or the scholar. They are the authority, because who's going to question them? Because they haven't studied Hebrew and Greek, which is why I think God does preserve his word in the commons man language. And you can watch that in my video series on the King James. But when you have one final authority, God's preserved word, and there's no secret hidden practices behind closed doors, that transparency is very important. It's a very good distinction. So a religion reveals their literature and practices to the public and allows scrutiny and critical discussion about it. And I think it's just good. Truth has nothing to hide. You shouldn't fear anybody coming in, like it's like a third-party audit of your finances. If you're doing what's right, then let them come. You have nothing to hide. 5, a cult tends to limit the education of their youth to avoid any outside worldview that might be critical of the cult's teachings. Often with great intensity, they will burn or remove books. They cut off modes of communication, like you can only use the internet 3 hours a week, and outside interference. Anything that they need to cancel or censor or devalue or say it's misinformation, anything to be able to limit freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of information. That is a usual mark of a cult, because they do have something to hide. They are intimidated by outside information. Whereas a religion usually will develop institutions for teaching their youth, but their teachings aren't so bizarre that if somebody from the outside looked in, they'd be like, what in the world? Huh? That is freakish. And it's usually very, very often perverse. You'll see that when men are in charge and when men lose accountability, I'm not saying just men as in males, mankind. There just seems to be the sexual perversion that creeps in. And somebody described, it was the Screw Tape Letters. Have you ever read this by C.S. Lewis? And he said that God is the author of pleasure. And Satan can only counterfeit God in everything that he does. But because Satan can't actually create pleasure, what he does is he has the law of diminishing returns. It's like donuts. The first donut's really good, so you think the second donut's going to be really good, so you eat it and you're like, that wasn't as good as the first one. Maybe this flavor will be good. And you eat it, now I'm feeling gross, and it wasn't that good. And that's how sin is. It's the law of diminishing returns. And that's how addiction works, that I'm going to smoke some weed, and so I get high to here, and the next time I smoke some weed and it's only here, and so I have to smoke more weed, and then it's here, and I smoke more weed to get the same level of pleasure. And what did that have to do with anything? Because it's sexually perverse. So when men are in power and they have everything that they ever want in the world and there's no accountability, they think, I'm going to enjoy this secret pleasure. And then it's not quite as good, so they have to become a little bit more perverse. And then this secret pleasure. That wasn't as good as I thought it was. And then they just become more degenerate and more degenerate and more degenerate, to where you look and you think, who would ever do that? But yet it seems to be consistent in the lives of corrupt leaders and cult leaders. So who does that? People who have absolute authority and no accountability on earth. And that, I was talking about point 5, a religion will develop institutions for teaching, and their teachings aren't weird and perverse. And so what happens is that they are societally acceptable to a point, unless freedom isn't valued in your country. And they don't make it to where you can't be exposed to critical worldviews. For instance, Christian education, we do teach the creation, intelligent design theory, but also you should be exposed to evolution, and then it should be judged according to its scientific value and the laws of thermodynamics. And it's just really important to not get blindsided, because how awful is it if you've only been taught one thing and then suddenly somebody challenges you and you have no idea what to think about it because you've never experienced it before. I don't know any Christian who says you can't go hear that other person, or you can't read that book that talks about this type of science, or you may not read Richard Dawkins and scrutinize what you believe. No. You just need to, know why you believe what you believe. Read that, and then read the other stuff. Read evidence that demands a verdict. Read things that give the atheistic viewpoint. Read somebody that gives a Buddhist viewpoint, and look and say what is true and what isn't true. And a religion usually isn't afraid of outside thought. They are okay with being challenged. 6, cults do not reconcile their religious message with society at large, to where their members can move freely and maintain neighborly and economic relationships outside of their little cloistered society, and to function as citizens around the world. You'll see that very often cults will stay in a somewhat local community, or they'll have 3 or 4 communes scattered in a country, but it's still in that local community. There's some acceptance of it, like the police force and the male people in Texas, where that Mormon commune was. They all were part of that cult, so that if the women or children tried to escape, the policemen could catch them and bring them back. But the women and children, and very often the men, were told where to work and who to work for and how much government assistance they needed, and if they could go to the hospital, because they couldn't just function in any public arena, because then people might challenge their thought process or say, hey, you're not looking that great. Is there something going on at home that maybe you would like to talk about? People who have nothing to hide, they can go wherever they want. And that's what is religions that sustain themselves have done just that, where they can go country to country and worship as they please and talk with who they want to talk to, work with who they want to work with, and they are societally functional. They're not so dependent upon that little cloister. Lastly, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought. You cannot maintain a cult without those things present. And I think that wherever you go, when you start seeing persecution of people with belief systems, you might start questioning who's in power and why they're doing it. The Church of England, the Orthodox Church of England, when they brought people over to America and Virginia and that monetary system, there were two lines of people who came to America. There were those who came for freedom of religion, and then there came people who came for more profit. They've both always been here. Those are just the two story arcs of the world. But the Orthodox Church of England wanted to maintain control and wanted to maintain thought and wanted to maintain their currency and their taxes and the tithes that went to the Church of England through the state. And you look at the Catholic Church, and it conquered Europe and had its grips into the people through fear and just the history of how they would squash people who taught their children English or who read the Bible in their own language, because there is no allowance of freedom of thought or freedom of conscience. And you look, and Marxism does the same thing, that you will conform or you will die or you will be re-educated. I have some friends who live in countries where the Hindus do the same thing. It's like Hindu mixed with the mafia. And they'll come in, and if you try to live a life that's different than the Hindu culture, they will persecute you. They will not let you rent their houses. Same with Islam, that they'll kick you out of their families and they won't let you get a job in that area, or they'll beat you, or they'll shoot you. Buddhism, it just seems that wherever false teachings are, that they will not allow there to be freedom of thought. You may not propagate. You may not share your thoughts. And I just want to challenge you with this. Have you read the history of the Baptist Church? That Roger Williams, who came here and wanted to have freedom of conscience and wrote a lot about toleration of religion, toleration of conscience, and he was kicked out of the church and was literally blacklisted from an entire state. And so he moved to Rhode Island, where he wanted to establish free trade and fair trade with the Native Americans. He was so well respected in that community with the Native Americans that he was actually brought in as an intermediary because he treated them like people. He wasn't there for gain, financial gain. He was there to have freedom, and he promoted freedom, and he had the First Baptist Church of America. You look at John Leland, who was neighbors with James Madison, who wrote the Bill of Rights, and really needed more people to sign on to the Constitution, and they didn't want to until they had the Bill of Rights. And so John Leland, who was a huge anti-slavery voice of that age, was a Baptist, and he promoted the Bill of Rights and freedom of speech and freedom of conscience and freedom from government interference in religion. Because whenever money and government and religion mixes, it's this crazy, powerful idealism that can just squelch individualism. And it was because of the Baptist ministers, and especially John Leland, that we have the Bill of Rights in America. We have more rights in America than even the Bible talks about as far as the individual. And that's because of Baptists. Look at the history of independent fundamental Baptists and their doctrine and what they promote wherever they go. Wherever they go, there's freedom. And I think that wherever a cult goes, there's a lack of freedom. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're studying cults and really asking, who is culty? That being said, I'm going to discuss man worship, because just because an institution and their doctrine isn't culty doesn't mean that man doesn't somehow get in there and mess it up. And so there is man worship, there is culty-likeness within the independent fundamental Baptists, and you need to identify it so you don't get caught up in it.